Well, I finally built my dining room table. I say finally because my plan for this thing started years ago when I found a stack of cherry slabs in my grandfather's basement. At the time, I was still living in Wyoming, so I hauled the slabs out west with the intent of building a table. But that wasn't the last road trip this stack of lumber would be taking. After a few years of still not being a table, I moved back to Minnesota and brought the cherry slabs with me. Then, I lugged them along on a road trip to Atlanta to attend Workbench Con, where I stopped in Kentucky to see some friends with some much bigger equipment than I have at home. I want to give a huge thank you to Lakeside Woodworks for helping me out with this project, and to Rockler Woodworking and Hardware for their support. Now, let's get to work. The process almost always looks the same when you're taking lumber from rough to flat and square. But when you increase the scale of your materials, the tools tend to look a little different than they do in a small home shop. First, you flatten one side. At Lakeside, this is done with a Slab Master. A Slab Master uses a massive circular cutter head to glide over the workpiece and knock down the high spots while it sits securely on a flat bed. Taking surprisingly large bites, the cutter head is lowered incrementally until the top surface of my cherry slabs are perfectly flat. To flatten the bottom side of truly large slabs, you would just flip them over and repeat the process. But when you have a massive planer standing by, you just shove slabs through there flat side down, and in no time you have reduced my big pile of unruly cherry slabs to perfectly surfaced and well-mannered pieces of lumber. The last step is to get a straight, square edge, which is easy to do with a high-quality track saw, and so much track that I would get winded if I tried to run the length of it. To everyone over at Lakeside Woodworks, I truly appreciate your help. The access to your equipment, and even more importantly, your knowledge about building tables, saved me a ton of time and heartache that I would have had to suffer through doing this all in my own shop. I left links to Lakeside's website and social media channels down in the description. Make sure you go check them out. I took those slabs home and stacked them perfectly flat with lots of weight on top in my basement for a few months while I waited for an opening in my schedule to tackle this large and long-awaited project. When that time finally came, I was thrilled to see that everything stayed flat and I was able to jump right into it. I ripped the last live edge off of each of the slabs, then set about fixing the imperfections. This is the first piece of furniture where I've ever attempted to inlay bow ties or butterflies or whatever you want to call them. I convinced myself a long time ago that I didn't like the looks of them. But to be honest, it's more likely I didn't like them because I was intimidated by the process of cutting them by hand. Lucky for me, Rockler has the answer. Rockler has an inlay system that uses a router to cut both the inlay and the recess with the same template, resulting in a perfect fit. First, I gave myself a rough idea of the layout I wanted, using the different size templates that come with the kit. The key to the whole operation is this removable sleeve that slides over the guide bushing. To cut the recess, just secure the template into the larger frame and secure that to the workpiece. Then, with the sleeve on the guide bushing, just plunge into the workpiece and hog out the material. As long as the template is secure, you can't screw this up. To cut out the inlay, just remove that brass sleeve, then plunge into a scrap piece of wood, being careful that the bushing only rides along the template. If you pull away from the template at all, you'll cut into your inlay and you'll have an imperfection. I needed a bunch of these in different sizes, so I used double-sided tape to attach the template to some long scraps of wood that were the same thickness as my workpiece. Then, I clamped those scraps to my bench so the template couldn't move. This way, I could slide my piece under the template and clamp it to the bench separately. With this little setup, I could make a cut, push or pull the piece through to the next open space, reclamp, and cut again. It resulted in a much faster operation, and I went overboard with it. I only needed 13 butterflies for my tabletop, but I cut out more like 30 using all the different sizes. I figured I was set up and I had the material ready, so why not cut out a ton just to save them for the next time I needed it. Since I knew that this table was going to be the first time I actually used butterfly inlays in a piece of furniture, a few months ago I put out a video where I tested the strength of a bunch of different shapes. This classic old style was the winner, but there were some other interesting results, so make sure you check out that video too. I added a slight bevel to the bottom side of the inlays using a belt sander. This would make them easier to press into the tabletop. It's pretty ugly, but this side will be buried in wood, so it doesn't really matter. I spread glue all around inside the recess, then tapped the inlay down until it bottomed out. Ideally, it sits just proud of the surrounding wood so I can true it up later. With the cracks mechanically secured with bow ties, it was time to fill them in and make them a little prettier. First, I taped the ends and bottom to make sure nothing could flow out of the wood and make a huge mess. Then, I mixed a small cup of epoxy at a time and added a tiny bit of black dye, then started pouring it into every crack I could find. This was a pretty time-consuming process because some of those cracks were relatively cavernous on the inside, even if they looked small. I would fill them to overflowing, then a few minutes later, they would look empty again because this slow-setting epoxy would just continue to flow until it had no place left to go. It took most of a day to completely fill every void and let the epoxy harden. Then, I stripped the tape off the bottom and started flattening the high spots back down. Normally, I would have done this on my drum sander, but my conveyor belt had just recently broken, so I had to use my planer. I took tiny little passes and stopped well before making contact with the bare wood to avoid any chance of introducing snipe to the ends of the boards. I needed all the material I could get, and losing a few inches to snipe would have reduced the overall size of my tabletop. When I dared not go any deeper, I finished knocking down the epoxy with a hand sander. This is by no means finish sanding, just getting the show side back to flat so I could flip the boards over and repeat the process on the bottom side. With the boards now in perfect shape, I arranged them to hide the seams and spread out the bow ties as much as possible. Then, I clamped them together and marked out locations for biscuits. Biscuit joiners seem to have fallen out of fashion lately, but it's basically the poor man's domino. Just line it up, plunge in, and you've got yourself a loose mortise and tenon situation that adds to the strength and helps keep a big glue up like this flat. Finally, it was time for the big glue up, but honestly it wasn't any different than a small one. Slather glue on all the surfaces and inside all the biscuit slots, then push all the pieces together. With scrap wood across the edges for protection, I started adding clamps until I ran out of them. I used a wet rag to clean up as much of the excess glue from the top as I could. Then, after the glue dried, I put the clamps away and scraped off the squeeze out on the bottom. I used a track guide with my circular saw to square up the ends, then it was time for sanding. Oh, let me tell you about the sanding. You see, back in my day, before we had electric-powered sanding contraptions, and even before sandpaper was commercially available, we would go down to the beach and collect buckets of sand that we would bring home and sort by grain size. This whole time, I've also been working on the legs for my table, but for the sake of telling a coherent story, I decided to split it into a second segment. The legs will be made up of these massive beams that came from the same stack of cherry in Grandpa's basement. Though small enough to work with my equipment, this wood is still heavy and awkward, so I roughly marked out the components, then made a few cuts to make things a little lighter. Where those overly wide slabs utilized a slab master and a track saw to get flat sides and square corners, I milled up the stock for the legs with a joiner and a planer. Same process, just different tools. If you haven't picked up on it already, this project is an important one for me. Heirloom lumber going into a piece of furniture that my family will use every day, how cool is that? And on top of that, this is my 100th project video. I didn't plan it that way, but what a cool coincidence. If you've been around my channel a while, thank you. It's because of you guys that I get to call this my job. If you're new to the channel, you might want to go back through those other 99 projects and see what else you might like. Thanks again to everyone for watching. Please make sure you give me a like and hit subscribe so you can stay caught up with the next 100 projects. The legs also got the epoxy crack treatment, but I had enough extra material here that I was less worried about snipe. And now we come to what I regarded as the most complicated part of this build, angles. If you think you want to build this table for yourself, the most important thing you need to remember is 5 degrees. As long as you can consistently cut at 5 degrees, you can use your materials to guide you through the rest of the joinery. And as long as we're talking about you building a version of this table, that brings us to the shameless plug portion of our show. I have plans available on my website that will help you navigate the various measurements, angles, and other intricacies of this project. Check out the link in the description to go get the plans for yourself, and in the process, you'll be helping to support my channel, and more importantly, convincing my wife that this is a worthwhile business venture. Still not convinced? Trestle tables tend to be a massive piece of furniture. As one piece, this thing wouldn't fit through any of the doors of my house. That's why I designed it to break down into the smallest possible components. 1 top, 2 legs, 2 stretchers. 5 separate pieces makes this design easy to move around, yet once it's assembled, it's more than strong enough for the rigors of everyday table life. Okay, enough infomercial. Back to that 5-degree angle. To consistently get that angle in the cuts and joinery for these legs, in both left and right sides, I used Rockler's new precision miter gauge paired with their miter gauge fence, and man, that made this part easy. Starting with the vertical parts, they each got an angled half lap cut into one end. Then the top horizontal piece got angled half laps cut into both ends. Then, I test fit those pieces together to make sure everything was on the up and up. For the foot, I knew I wanted the joints to intersect 4 inches from each end. Then, I used a test piece to mark the other side of the cut. I set up my table saw fence and the stop block on the miter fence to match each of these marks, then hogged out the material in between. The leg didn't quite fit that space, so I bumped my stop over just a hair and made another cut. There, perfect fit. With the stop set up like this, I could cut both joints in one side of each foot, then pivot the miter gauge and cut the other sides. Like the old saying goes, measure once, cut 4 times, or something like that. Now I have a perfect top, foot, and slightly overlength legs with the joints cut into one end, so when I fit the pieces together, I can just mark the real-world position of the top joint and overall length of the legs and make the appropriate cuts. And man, removing this much material with a dado stack makes a big mess. Speaking of blades, I made as many of the through cuts as I could with a cross-cut blade before installing the dado stack. Then, I made every single dado cut without ever adjusting the height until it came to the stretchers for the top and bottom. Then, I swapped back to the cross-cut blade to cut the vertical pieces to the final length. This kept the blade rodeo to a minimum and kept the joints consistent. For a little more detail, I drew an arch at the bottom of the foot, then cut some big bevels into the ends. I cut that arch out on my bandsaw, then finessed my way to the line with a spindle sander before hand sanding with some sandpaper glued to a bendy board. That arch in the feet exposed the very ends of the vertical pieces, so I traced a line, then cut and sanded them down to match. Some of my half-lap joints weren't quite perfect on account of the semi-rough surface left behind by the saw blade, so I smoothed them out, taking tiny bites with my shoulder plane. I started from the outside and cut towards the middle to keep from blowing out the other side and wrecking my square edge. I pre-drilled holes in the foot for hardware now because it would be much harder to do once the leg was glued together. Then, I used a Forstner bit to drill a shallow recess to hide the heads of the screws in the underside of the foot. Holy smokes. It sure feels like a lot of steps. My mouth is getting dry and I haven't even glued the legs together yet. How long have I been at this anyway? Really? Over 11 minutes? Is anybody even listening to me at this point? Wait, what do you mean it's still recording? The glue for the legs went off without incident. I put tape at the intersections of all the joints so it'd be easier to clean up, then clamped everything snugly and wiped up the squeeze out. I decided to use dowels in all the joints to make things that much prettier and that much stronger. I made simple little jigs to get the placement consistent. Just tap a nail through the hole, then flip the jig over to the other side and do it again. I used Rockler's portable drill guide to make sure I got clean, straight holes all the way through. I also clamped a piece of scrap to the bottom to avoid tear out when the bit bursts out the other side. I could have potentially used the drill press for this, but at this point the legs weigh close to 40 pounds, and that would have been really hard to keep level on my small drill press table. I made my own dowels using scraps of cherry that I removed earlier. First, I cut square strips, then made a small tenon on one end that fit into the socket that came with this dowel plate. As I try to put this into words now, I realize I could have saved a step by just using a larger socket from my own set. Nice work, smart guy. I tapered one end and knocked back the sharp corners on a disc sander. Then, I started running the dowels through the plate, starting at the largest hole and progressing through the smaller ones. If you're going to do this, wear your earplugs. This might be the loudest and most painful noise ever to echo through my shop. Once I got to the final hole, I found I could get a better surface finish if I cut them to length as I went along. Running the full-length dowel through the plate introduced a bunch of wobble that left the surface all ripply. With the dowels made, I slopped on the glue and twisted them as they went into the holes. I cleaned up as much glue as I could while it was wet, then used a flush trim saw to cut away the protruding dowels after the glue had dried. At long last, I got to put the base of the table together and see what it would actually look like. I clamped the stretchers in place, then drilled and ran in a single screw through the top by hand as straight as I could so that I could get the clamp out of the way. Then, I used the drill guide with the built-in stop blocks to make the recesses for the larger screw heads. I drilled one more hole by hand so I could use the full-size hardware to hold things together while I took out the first screw and drilled that recess. This odd order of operations made it so I didn't have to adjust my depth stop more than once. Then, I used the drill guide to drill the last 3 pilot holes and ran in the hardware. I put a little paste wax on each one to cut down on the friction. With the base turned upside down, the bottom was easier. I drilled pilot holes into the stretcher using the holes in the foot that I drilled earlier as guides. Then, I ran in my screws. I'm using these little figure-8 style fasteners to attach the top to the base. You might even be able to see them if my evil tripod hadn't upped its sabotage game another step and found a way to take my camera out of focus. To make them easier to install, I set up a fence on the drill guide and adjusted the depth stops. That made it super easy to line up with my marks and drill little recesses for the fasteners to sit flush with the top surface. After that, it was just a whole lot of sanding. Since sanding isn't even remotely interesting to watch, how about I just explain it while you enjoy the transformation of the gorgeous cherry wood when it gets its first taste of armor seal. Everything was sanded with 80, 150, then 220 grit sandpaper. With the top being the only source of real daily human interaction, I gave it a little extra attention. I used a mineral spirit soaked rag to rub it down, thereby removing extra dust and wetting the wood just enough to raise any truant fibers. Then, I sanded with 220 one more time to get that silky smooth surface we all love. That was a long road, but the time, effort, and miles were worth it. My boys wanted to help finish up, so they tapped the fasteners into their recesses with another heirloom. That wooden hammer that looks like a judge's gavel? That belonged to the same grandpa and came from the same basement on the same day as all the cherry wood that went into the table. Talk about coming full circle, right? I didn't even plan that. I was just looking for a good way to conclude this thing, and bam, there it was. Well, this thing turned out way better than I could have hoped for. You may be asking yourself, well, what about chairs? Well, Matt Cremona is a little bit of a local to me now, and I've been talking to him about his chair kits, and I think that's the route we're going to go, get a couple of cherry chair kits from Matt, and build them to match the table. So that's going to be a future video you should look out for. I'm not sure when, but it'll be coming. Another project is, what do you think of my dank little dining room? It's almost a shame to have such a classy table in this dark space. So we're going to knock out some of these built-ins, knock out this wall, redo the kitchen on the other side. So it's going to get a lot nicer in here eventually. That's another project to look forward to. Thank you very much to Rockler for supporting this video. All those tools that I used in this video are really high quality, and they truly did help me build this to a higher standard than I had really thought I was capable of. So go into the description, check out all the links to all those tools, check Rockler out. They're a great company. Also, huge thank you to Nick and everybody over at Lakeside Woodworks. Their help and their hospitality when I was down there, just a great group of people. They're great in the community, so go check out all their social media channels, their website, links to that too. Finally, thanks to all of you guys, the viewers, whether you're new to the channel or you've been around for a long time, it's you guys that make this possible. So thank you for watching. I'm going to ask you to please like, please subscribe if you're not already, do the notification thing, and then go down in the description and check out all these links that I keep talking about. Go buy the plans, go visit Rockler, go visit all of that stuff. It goes a long way to helping out the channel and helping out the business. So, okay, yep, commercial over. Thank you very much, guys. We'll see you next time.